Today, we are going to unpack a pretty mind-bending idea, one that could totally shift how you think about life itself. We're going to look at biology through this wild new lens of generative artificial intelligence.
So, let's think about your DNA. For ever, we've all heard the same thing. It's the blueprint of life. This detailed pre-written plan for how to build, well, you. And look, it's a useful story. It gives us this image of a static, clear map that the body just has to follow. Super simple, easy to get your head around. But what if that's not really the whole picture? What if the genome isn't a static blueprint at all? What if it's much more like the incredibly complex, pre-trained weights of something like a large language model? A system that isn't designed to just follow a map, but to generate the most logical next move based on all the context it has. Okay, so let's really dive into this. To get why this new idea is so powerful, we first have to see where the old blueprint model starts to fall apart. The old blueprint model basically says your final form is all laid out from the very beginning, like a super detailed drawing. But life, it just doesn't work that way, does it? The generative model, on the other hand, sees our final form as something we get to through tons of tiny, iterative updates that are always responding to what's going on around them. So in this view, the genome isn't a map. It's more like a set of starting priors, these really powerful tendencies that guide how we develop, but they don't lock in every single step. So if the blueprint idea is flawed, what's the alternative? Let's explore this idea of life's generative model. This is where we can build this really powerful new analogy with AI and where things are going to start to click. Okay, so here's the core analogy. Think about how an AI like GPT writes a document. The document is the final output. It generates it word by word, or token by token, and it does that based on its core programming, its weights. Well, biology does something uncannily similar. The organism is the final document. Each cell is like a token, and the genome, that's the pre-trained weights. The entire process of development, from a single cell to a whole person, that's like inference. It's the very act of generating. This brings us to a really key biological process called morphogenesis, which is just a fancy word for how an organism develops its shape. Now, in our new model, this isn't just a construction project. No, it's more like inference happening in physical space. Each and every cell uses its genetic starting points, its priors, plus all the signals from its immediate neighborhood to figure out the most logical, the most coherent next thing to do. And this quote just nails the shift in thinking. We're moving away from this idea that life is assembled, like building a car from a kit of parts. Instead, it's being generated, almost like a story that's discovering its own plot as it goes, constantly resolving itself into a more and more coherent shape. Now, here's what's so wild. This whole generative process, it's not a one-way street. It's actually a constant feedback loop, where the body is, in a very real sense, writing itself. This is what's known as an autoregressive loop, and it's totally fundamental to both generative AIs and to life. Here's how it works. A cell reads what's going on right around it. It checks its internal rules from the genome, then it makes its best guess for the next move. Maybe it divides, for example. But, and this is the key part, that action changes the environment. Now there's a new cell, new physical forces, new chemical signals. And that brand new context becomes the prompt for the very next decision. I mean, that's just such a perfect way to say it. Every single thing the body does becomes part of the input for the next thing it does. It's this beautiful, dynamic, recursive dance of creation. So you might be wondering, how does a tiny cell handle all this information without getting totally overwhelmed? Well, the answer is tissues. A cell doesn't need to read the state of the entire body all at once. Its local tissue acts as a context window, which is the exact same term we use in AI, giving it just the most relevant nearby information it needs to make a good decision right here, right now. And you can see here how that context is layered. A cell is listening to its immediate neighbors, for sure. But it's also being influenced by the bigger state of its tissue, the overall function of its organ, and even the hormonal state of the entire organism. It's a whole series of nested context windows, all the way from the hyperlocal to the global. This all leads to a massive question. If the genome is like an AI model's weights, how in the world did it get trained to be so good at generating life? Well, an AI gets trained using something called backpropagation. It makes a guess, it calculates how wrong it was, that's the loss, and then it uses a bunch of math to adjust its internal weights. It's super fast and it's all internal. Life's training mechanism, natural selection. And it is slow, so slow.
It's ecological, it's external, and instead of a neat little mathematical loss function, its judge is just reality.
Right. The error signal for life isn't some number in a computer, it's survival. Did this particular form, this organism, manage to keep existing and reproduce, or did it not? That's the biological version of loss. Natural selection is just the filter for those consequences, slowly, painstakingly sculpting those genomic priors over millions and millions of years.
So why does any of this theory actually matter in the real world? Well, because when you see life as this generative process, it completely reframes how we understand what it means to be healthy and what happens when things go wrong. Just look at this. From this point of view, diseases aren't just broken parts. They're often glitches in this continuation logic. Cancer? That's a cell that's perfectly generating its local next steps, but those steps are completely nonsensical and destructive for the organism as a whole. Fibrosis? That's a repair signal that gets stuck on go and just keeps generating scar tissue, failing to ever terminate. You can start to see so many different diseases as different flavors of generative failure.
And that brings us to a totally new definition of health. It's not some static state you get to, like a finish line. It's a dynamic process. It's the ongoing successful ability to keep generating the next coherent version of yourself, day after day, in the face of all the challenges and chaos the world throws at you.
Okay, let's zoom all the way out for the final, biggest idea. This whole generative process doesn't just explain how bodies are built, it might actually point to the very origin of intelligence itself. Think about it. Natural selection is pretty brutal. It's all trial and error, and a lot of that is error. Organisms just act, and then reality deals out the consequences, good or bad. But over immense timescales, life found a better way. It started to bring that process inside. A mind, a nervous system, lets an organism simulate potential actions and their likely consequences before actually doing them. And that's really what intelligence is, right? It's evolution learning how to model the loss before you have to actually suffer the loss. And that leaves us with this final amazing thought. Being alive isn't a one-and-done assembly job. It is a continuous, active process of self-creation. It's the art of using all the lessons of the past, encoded deep within your genome, to read the present moment and constantly, correctly, generate the next viable version of yourself. The body, it turns out, is a story that never, ever stops writing.